December 16, 1985, East 46th Street, Midtown Manhattan. The last light has drained from the sky over the East River, and the city has tipped into its winter evening rhythm. Taxis stacking bumper to bumper along 3rd Avenue. Pedestrians moving in thick currents toward the subway entrances at Grand Central. Restaurant windows glowing warm against the December cold. Christmas decorations hang from lampposts. Office workers push through revolving doors carrying shopping bags and briefcases. And outside Sparks Steakhouse, a Midtown institution where the city's wealthiest power brokers conduct business over dry-aged porterhouses and bottles of Barolo. For men are standing on the sidewalk in identical long trench coats and Russian-style fur hats, positioned at intervals that look casual but are not casual at all. A black Lincoln Town car pulls to the curb. The passenger door opens, and Paul Castellano steps onto the sidewalk. He is 69 years old, the boss of the Gambino crime family, the largest, wealthiest, most politically connected criminal organization in the United States. Castellano has run the family since 1976, when his brother-in-law Carlo Gambino passed the throne to him over the objections of underboss Aniello Delacroce and an entire generation of street-hardened earners who considered Castellano a businessman playing at being a gangster. He operates from a hilltop mansion on Staten Island, surrounds himself with white-collar associates and construction industry executives, and has spent the better part of a decade treating the family's traditional street crews, the men who generate revenue through gambling, loan sharking, hijacking, and narcotics, with a detachment that borders on contempt. Thomas Bilotti, his driver and newly appointed underboss, exits the other side and begins walking around the front of the vehicle. Bilotti is a loyalist elevated beyond his competence, a man whose sole qualification for the second highest position in the family is his willingness to do whatever Castellano asks without question. His appointment enraged the capos who believed the position should have gone to someone with operational credibility. But Castellano did not seek their counsel. He had stopped seeking anyone's counsel long before this evening. Neither man reaches the door of Sparks Steakhouse. The 4 men in trench coats close the distance in seconds. The first shots strike Castellano in the head at near contact range. He drops to the pavement outside the restaurant entrance, his body crumpling between the car and the curb. Bilotti is hit almost simultaneously, rounds fired into his skull as he rounds the hood of the Lincoln. He collapses beside the front tire. The shooters walk away. Not running, walking. They disperse into the Midtown foot traffic, absorbed by the flow of commuters and holiday shoppers within half a block, for men becoming invisible in a crowd that does not yet understand what has just happened. The entire operation, from the moment the Lincoln stopped to the moment the last shooter disappeared, takes less than 60 seconds. Parked across the street, idling in a car with a clear view of the restaurant entrance, John Gotti watches Paul Castellano die. He is 45 years old, a Gambino capo who runs his crew out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens. He is dressed immaculately, expensive overcoat, silk tie, hair swept back, because John Gotti is always dressed immaculately. Appearance, to Gotti, is not vanity. It is authority. It is the visible declaration that a man of power has arrived and expects to be recognized. Beside Gotti sits the man who made the logistics of this evening possible. Salvatore Gravano, Sammy the Bull, is 40 years old, a Bensonhurst-born soldier built like a fire hydrant, compact and dense with muscle, who has been accumulating power within the family through construction industry racketeering and a reputation for violence that is precise rather than reckless. Gravano helped Gotti plan every element of the Castellano hit. He selected the shooters from a pool of reliable Gambino soldiers and associates. He coordinated their positioning, their timing, their escape routes. He arranged for backup teams to be stationed nearby in case the primary crew encountered complications. The assassination of a sitting mafia boss is not an impulsive act. It is an operation that requires the organizational discipline of a military engagement and the secrecy of an intelligence operation. Gravano provided both. What made the Castellano hit extraordinary was not merely its audacity, but its illegality within the Mafia's own governing framework. The Commission, the body established in 1931 by Charles Lucky Luciano and the founding generation of American Mafia bosses to regulate inter-family relations and prevent exactly this kind of unilateral power seizure. required that any assassination of a sitting boss be sanctioned by the heads of the other families. Gotti had sought no such approval. He had not consulted Genovese boss Vincent, Chin Gigante, or Lucchese boss Vittorio Vic, Amuso, or any of the other commission members whose authority theoretically governed the internal affairs of all 5 New York families. He had simply decided that Castellano needed to die, organized the killing with Gravano's help, and executed it in the most public setting imaginable, a Midtown Manhattan sidewalk during the evening rush hour, in front of dozens of witnesses, 6 blocks from the headquarters of the New York City Police Department. The brazenness was deliberate. Gotti wanted the world to know that a new power had arrived. And within weeks of the Castellano assassination, the transfer of authority was complete. Gotti installed himself as the boss of the Gambino family. Gravano rose steadily through the hierarchy, eventually becoming consigliere and then underboss, the second most powerful position in the organization. Frank DeCicco, the capo who had helped facilitate the conspiracy against Castellano, became underboss initially, but in April 1986, a car bomb killed DeCicco in a Brooklyn parking lot, an attack widely attributed to Genovese boss Chin Gigante, who had been a Castellano ally and viewed Gotti's unauthorized hit as a violation of commission protocol that demanded a response. The bomb, packed with plastic explosives and detonated by remote control, was a message. Gotti's seizure of power would not go unanswered. But the retaliatory strike failed to escalate into open war, and Gotti survived the political crisis that followed, in part because Gravano's strategic counsel and operational discipline helped stabilize the family during its most vulnerable period. By the late 1980s, John Gotti had become something no mafia boss was ever supposed to become: famous. He was photographed by tabloids outside his social club in Little Italy. He was profiled in magazines. Television cameras captured him arriving at courtrooms in hand-tailored double-breasted suits, flashing a smile that communicated absolute confidence that no prosecutor in America could touch him. The press gave him a name that would define his public identity for the rest of his life: the Teflon Don. 3 times the federal government brought Gotti to trial, on racketeering charges in 1986, on assault charges in 1990, on additional racketeering counts in between, and 3 times he walked free. Juries acquitted him. Witnesses recanted or disappeared. Key evidence was excluded on procedural grounds. In one case, a juror was later discovered to have been bribed by a Gambino associate. Gotti's ability to evade conviction became a source of humiliation for the FBI and the Eastern District of New York, and a source of swaggering confidence for Gotti himself, who began behaving as though his invincibility were a permanent condition rather than a statistical improbability. Behind him stood Gravano, quieter, more disciplined, more strategically minded, and increasingly essential to the family's operational machinery. While Gotti courted attention, Gravano managed the empire. He oversaw the family's construction rackets, controlled Teamsters locals, mediated disputes between capos, and maintained the internal discipline that Gotti's flamboyance constantly threatened to undermine. Gravano was not a man who sought the spotlight. He was a man who understood that real power in the mafia was exercised in private, through the ability to generate revenue and the willingness to enforce consequences. But the dynamic between the 2 men, one who craved attention and one who craved control, contained within it a structural instability that neither of them fully recognized. Because the qualities that made Gravano indispensable to Gotti, his intelligence, his ambition, his operational independence, were the same qualities that made him dangerous. And the qualities that defined Gotti, his arrogance, his need for public admiration, his tendency to say too much to too many people, were creating a trail of evidence that was slowly, methodically being assembled by men with badges and tape recorders who had learned from their previous failures and were determined not to lose again. The men who would ultimately destroy John Gotti did not carry guns. They carried warrants, subpoenas, and magnetic tape. And the place where they found him was not a fortified compound or a remote safe house, but a storefront social club on Mulberry Street in the heart of Little Italy. A location so brazen, so publicly associated with Gotti's power, that his decision to conduct business there would eventually be recognized as one of the most catastrophic strategic errors in the history of the American Mafia. The Rave Night Social Club occupied a narrow ground floor space at 247 Mulberry Street, wedged between the tenement buildings and espresso bars of what remained of Manhattan's old Italian quarter. The club had a long history within the Gambino family. It had previously served as the headquarters of former underboss Aniello Della Croce, and after Della Croce's death from cancer in December 1985, just 2 days before the Castellano assassination, Gotti had claimed it as his own base of operations. Every Wednesday evening, Gotti held court at the rave night. Capos, soldiers, associates, and visitors from other families arrived to pay respects, discuss business, deliver tribute payments, and receive instructions. The gatherings were ritualistic, a weekly demonstration of Gotti's authority that served the same symbolic function as a royal audience. The boss sat. The subjects came to him. The problem was that the FBI was watching, and they had been watching for years. The Bureau's Gambino squad, operating out of the FBI's New York field office at 26 Federal Plaza, had assigned dedicated surveillance teams to monitor the rave night and document every individual who entered and exited the club. Agents photographed license plates. They cataloged faces. They cross-referenced visitors against organizational charts that the Bureau had been building and refining since the commission trial of 1985 to 1986, when Rudolph Giuliani's prosecution team had successfully convicted the heads of 3 of the 5 families and established the evidentiary framework for treating La Cosa Nostra as a single interconnected criminal enterprise under the RICO statutes. The Gambino family had escaped that particular prosecution largely intact. Castellano had been indicted but was killed before trial. But the legal and investigative infrastructure developed during the commission case had given the FBI tools and institutional knowledge that had not existed a decade earlier. The supervising agent driving the Gotti investigation was Bruce Mao, the head of the FBI's Gambino squad, a quiet, meticulous, relentlessly patient investigator who had studied Gotti's patterns with the intensity of an academic researcher. Mao understood that the previous failures to convict Gotti had stemmed not from a lack of criminal evidence, but from Gotti's ability to corrupt the trial process itself, through witness intimidation, juror tampering, and the strategic deployment of defense attorney Bruce Cutler, a combative former prosecutor who treated every courtroom appearance as a theatrical performance designed to cast Gotti as a misunderstood neighborhood businessman being persecuted by an overreaching government. Mao concluded that the next case against Gotti could not depend on witnesses who could be threatened or jurors who could be reached. It would have to be built on something that could not be intimidated, bribed, or cross-examined. It would have to be built on Gotti's own voice. The application for electronic surveillance authorization targeting the Rave Night Social Club moved through the federal court system with the weight of accumulated institutional frustration behind it. When the warrants were approved, FBI technicians installed listening devices inside the club itself, bugs concealed in locations that would capture conversations held in the main room where Gotti received visitors. But what the initial recordings revealed was both tantalizing and insufficient. Gotti was careful inside the main room of the rave night. He spoke in generalities. He used coded language. He deflected sensitive topics with gestures and nods that microphones could not capture. The conversations recorded in the club's public space provided intelligence, but not the kind of unambiguous, self-incriminating admissions that would survive a RICO trial. The breakthrough came when the FBI identified a second location, an apartment directly above the rave night, on the upper floors of the same building, occupied by a widow named Nettie Sorelli. Gotti, Gravano, and Consigliere Frank Locasio had been using the apartment as a private meeting space, retreating upstairs from the social club's main floor to conduct the most sensitive conversations away from what they assumed were surveilled areas. The logic was sound in theory. Move the real business to an unmarked residential space above the club where no one would think to look. But the FBI did think to look. Agents obtained authorization to install listening devices in the Sorelli apartment, and when the tapes began rolling, the investigation transformed overnight. What the bugs in the upstairs apartment captured was John Gotti being John Gotti, unfiltered, unguarded, and incapable of restraining himself. The recordings, accumulated over months of surveillance spanning late 1989 through 1990, contained hours of Gotti speaking openly about the family's criminal operations, his authority over capos and soldiers, his involvement in specific acts of racketeering, and his views on the internal politics of La Cosa Nostra. The tapes were a prosecutor's fantasy, the boss of the most powerful mafia family in America, narrating his own criminal enterprise in his own words, in a setting he believed to be secure. But the tapes contained something else, something that would prove far more consequential than any individual admission of criminal activity. Because scattered across hours of recorded conversation, in moments of frustration and carelessness, and the particular arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable, John Gotti talked about Sammy Gravano. And what he said was devastating. Gotti complained about Gravano's independence. He questioned Gravano's loyalty. He suggested that Gravano was accumulating too much personal wealth through his construction rackets. He mocked Gravano's intelligence. Most critically, in several recorded conversations with Frank Locascio, Gotti appeared to be strategically positioning Gravano to absorb blame for criminal activities that could form the basis of federal charges, effectively constructing a narrative in which Gravano, not Gotti, would bear the legal consequences if the government moved against the family's leadership. The underboss, in Gotti's private calculations, was not a partner. He was a shield, a disposable instrument whose primary utility, when the moment of crisis arrived, would be to stand between John Gotti and a prison cell. Gotti did not know the microphones were listening, and he did not yet understand that every word he spoke was being transcribed, cataloged, and prepared for presentation to the very man he was discussing, the man who had helped him kill Paul Castellano, who had organized the operational machinery of the family, who had committed 19 murders over the course of his career in organized crime, and who possessed the single quality that made him the most dangerous person in John Gotti's world: the intelligence to recognize when loyalty had become a one-way street. On December 11, 1990, the FBI moved. Agents arrested John Gotti, Salvatore Gravano, and Frank Locascio on federal racketeering charges encompassing murder, conspiracy to commit murder, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, and loan sharking. The indictment was massive, a comprehensive RICO case that sought to prove not merely individual criminal acts, but the existence of the Gambino family as an ongoing criminal enterprise with Gotti as its operating authority. The arrests were executed simultaneously, Gotti taken into custody outside the rave night, Gravano picked up at a separate location. All three defendants were held without bail, a signal from the court that the government's evidence was strong enough to justify the extraordinary measure of pretrial detention for a sitting mafia boss. For the first time in his career, John Gotti was not smiling for the cameras. And for the first time in their partnership, Gotti and Gravano were sitting in separate cells, unable to coordinate their defense, unable to align their stories, unable to maintain the mutual fiction that had sustained their alliance since that evening outside Sparks 5 years earlier. The tapes existed. The tapes could not be intimidated. And the tapes were about to be played for the one person in the world whose reaction John Gotti should have feared above all others. The Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan is a 12-story concrete fortress on Park Row, 3 blocks from City Hall, where the federal government houses its most sensitive pretrial detainees. The building has no architectural ambition. It exists to contain. And in the early months of 1991, it contained 3 men whose fates were now entangled in a legal proceeding that would determine the future of organized crime in America. John Gotti on one floor, Salvatore Gravano on another, and Frank Locascio somewhere between them. All 3 separated by the deliberate design of federal prosecutors who understood that the most dangerous thing they could do was allow these men to communicate. Gravano sat in his cell and waited. He was not a man accustomed to waiting. For the better part of 2 decades, he had been in constant motion, managing construction crews, mediating disputes between Gambino capos, overseeing loan sharking operations, attending sit-downs with representatives of other families, and periodically participating in the kind of violence that maintained the gravitational order of the organization. He had killed his first man in the early 1970s, and over the years that followed, he had been directly involved in 19 murders, some ordered by his superiors, some conducted in partnership with Gotti, some carried out in defense of his own position within the family's hierarchy. He was not a man who experienced moral anguish over these acts. Within the closed moral universe of La Cosa Nostra, violence was a tool of governance, and Gravano had wielded it with the efficiency of someone who understood its function without being consumed by its psychology. He was a pragmatist. He calculated. And now, locked inside a federal detention facility facing charges that carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, Salvatore Gravano was calculating again. The government's case was built on the rave night tapes and Gravano's defense attorneys, working in coordination with Gotti's lead counsel, initially Bruce Cutler before he was disqualified due to his own appearances on the surveillance recordings, had obtained access to the transcripts through the discovery process. What Gravano read in those transcripts altered the fundamental architecture of his understanding of where he stood within the Gambino family, and, more specifically, where he stood in relation to the man he had helped install as its boss. The conversations were damning not because of what they revealed about criminal activity. Gravano already knew the full scope of the family's operations, but because of what they revealed about Gotti's private estimation of his underboss. Gotti, speaking to Locasio in the apartment above the rave night, had characterized Gravano in terms that oscillated between dismissal and strategic sacrifice. He had complained about Gravano creating too much of his own wealth. He had suggested that Gravano's construction empire was operating with insufficient tribute flowing upward to the boss. He had implied, in language that prosecutors would later argue constituted a deliberate strategy, that Gravano bore primary responsibility for certain criminal acts that Gotti himself had authorized or directly participated in. The tapes painted a portrait not of a partnership between boss and underboss, but of a hierarchy in which the underboss existed to serve, to earn, and, if necessary, to absorb the punishment that the boss wished to avoid. For a man like Gravano, who had built his career on the principle that loyalty was reciprocal, that the men above you protected you in proportion to the service you rendered, the tapes represented something beyond personal insult. They represented an existential threat. If Gotti's private calculations reflected his genuine intentions, then Gravano was walking into a trial in which the defense strategy would quietly ensure that the underboss absorbed the heaviest charges while the boss positioned himself for another acquittal. Gravano had watched Gotti beat the government 3 times. He understood the mechanics, the jury manipulation, the witness intimidation, the theatrical defense that transformed courtrooms into stages for Gotti's public persona. But this time the evidence was different. The tapes were unambiguous. And if someone was going to absorb the weight of that evidence, Gotti had already decided who it would be. The approach from federal prosecutors came through channels that had been carefully prepared. Assistant United States Attorneys John Gleason and Andrew Maloney, operating under the supervision of the Eastern District of New York, had studied Gravano's psychology with the same analytical precision that Bruce Mau's surveillance teams had studied Gotti's movements. They understood that Gravano was not a man who could be broken by threats or intimidated by the prospect of imprisonment alone. He had spent his entire adult life accepting the possibility of prison as an operational cost of his chosen profession. What Gravano could not accept, what no man of his particular psychological composition could endure, was the realization that his sacrifice would be exploited by a man who had already decided to betray their partnership from above. The prosecutors played the tapes for Gravano. Not all of them. The selected portions. The segments in which Gotti discussed his underboss with contempt. The passages in which Gotti appeared to construct a narrative that shifted culpability downward. The moments in which the boss of the Gambino family revealed, in his own unguarded voice, that the bond forged outside Sparks Steakhouse had been, for him, a transaction rather than a covenant. The effect was precisely what the prosecution had anticipated. Gravano did not make his decision immediately. The process unfolded over weeks in late 1991, conducted in secrecy so total that even Gravano's own defense attorneys were initially unaware of the direction their client was moving. The stakes were almost incomprehensible. No underboss of a New York crime family had ever cooperated with the federal government. The act of turning informant, of violating omerta, the code of silence that every made member of La Cosa Nostra swore to uphold upon induction, carried an automatic death sentence within the organization. It was not a metaphorical consequence. It was a literal one. Men who cooperated were hunted. Their families were threatened. Their names became synonymous with the worst form of treachery that the Mafia's internal culture could imagine. To become a cooperating witness was to sever every connection to the world that had defined your entire adult existence, and to enter a new reality in which the government that had spent decades trying to imprison you was now your only protection. Gravano understood all of this. He had enforced these very rules himself. He had participated in the murders of men who had been suspected of far lesser acts of disloyalty than what he was now contemplating. And yet the calculation kept returning to the same conclusion. Gotti had betrayed him first. The tapes proved it, not in the dramatic, operatic fashion of a mafia assassination, but in the quiet, bureaucratic betrayal of a boss who had decided to sacrifice his underboss to save himself. Gravano had killed for this man. He had reorganized the family's operations for this man. He had stood beside him for 6 years as the second most powerful figure in the most powerful criminal organization in the country. And Gotti, when he believed no one was listening, had reduced all of it to a calculation of personal convenience. In November 1991, Salvatore Gravano formally agreed to cooperate with the United States government. The terms of the agreement were staggering in their implications. Gravano would provide complete and truthful testimony regarding all criminal activities he had knowledge of, including his own participation in 19 murders. In exchange, the government would recommend a substantially reduced sentence, place Gravano and his family in the witness security program, and guarantee his physical protection for the remainder of his life. The deal required Gravano to testify not only against Gotti, but against any other member of organized crime the government chose to prosecute using his testimony. He was, in effect, handing the federal government the keys to the internal architecture of the Gambino crime family, and by extension, to the broader network of inter-family relationships, commission politics, and criminal enterprises that constituted the American Mafia's operational infrastructure. When word reached Gotti that his underboss had flipped, the reaction inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center was one of controlled fury. Gotti understood immediately what Gravano's cooperation meant. This was not a peripheral associate cutting a deal to reduce a minor sentence. This was the underboss, the man who had been present for virtually every significant decision, every murder conspiracy, every act of racketeering that defined Gotti's tenure as boss. Gravano knew everything. He had been in the room. He had been in the car outside Sparks. He had been in the apartment above the rave night. He had been at the sit-downs, the inductions, the executions. There was no aspect of the Gambino family's criminal operations over the previous decade that Gravano could not describe in granular, first-hand detail. The Teflon Don had survived 3 trials by manipulating the human elements of the justice system: witnesses, jurors, attorneys. But he could not manipulate a tape recording of his own voice. And he could not manipulate the testimony of a man who had stood beside him through every act that the government now intended to prove. For the first time in John Gotti's career, there was no angle to play, no juror to reach, no witness to silence. The man who knew all the secrets had decided to tell them. The trial of John Gotti and Frank Locascio began in January 1992 at the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn, not Manhattan, where Gotti's previous acquittals had unfolded in courtrooms that felt like extensions of his personal theater. The choice of venue was deliberate. The Eastern District, under the leadership of United States Attorney Andrew Maloney, had wrestled the case away from the Southern District specifically because the prosecution team believed that Brooklyn's federal courthouse offered a more controlled environment, one less susceptible to the circus atmosphere that Gotti's celebrity had generated in previous proceedings. Judge Leo Glasser, a no-nonsense jurist with decades of experience on the federal bench, was assigned to preside. His first significant ruling set the tone for everything that followed. Bruce Cutler, Gotti's longtime defense attorney and public attack dog, was disqualified from representing him at trial on the grounds that Cutler's own voice appeared on the rave night surveillance tapes, making him a potential witness in the case he was attempting to defend. The disqualification stripped Gotti of the courtroom performer who had orchestrated his previous acquittals and forced him to rely on replacement counsel who lacked Cutler's theatrical instincts and intimate familiarity with Gotti's preferred defense strategy. The government's case was prosecuted by Assistant United States Attorney John Gleason, a methodical, understated attorney whose courtroom manner was the precise opposite of the bombastic style that Cutler had employed in Gotti's earlier trials. Where Cutler had played to the gallery, Gleason played to the evidence. Where Cutler had sought to transform trials into referendums on government overreach, Gleason sought to make the jury forget that the defendant was famous and focus exclusively on what the evidence proved. The strategy was built on 2 pillars: the rave night tapes and the testimony of Salvatore Gravano. Either one alone might have been sufficient to convict. Together, they constituted the most devastating evidentiary combination ever assembled against a sitting mafia boss. But the trial carried risks that the prosecution understood with clear-eyed precision. Gravano was not a sympathetic witness. He was a self-confessed participant in 19 murders, a man who had spent decades inside the machinery of organized crime and who was now cooperating with the government not out of moral awakening, but out of strategic self-preservation. The defense would attack his credibility with everything available. They would portray him as a serial killer who had purchased his freedom by telling prosecutors whatever they wanted to hear. They would argue that his testimony was fabricated, tailored to fit the government's theory of the case, and motivated entirely by the desire to escape the life sentence that awaited him if he went to trial alongside Gotti. Every defense attorney who had ever faced a cooperating mob witness knew the playbook: destroy the messenger, and the message dies with him. Gleason prepared for this with the meticulous care of a man who had studied every previous Gotti trial and cataloged every tactic that had produced acquittals. The Rave Night tapes would serve as the foundation, Gotti's own voice establishing the framework of criminal activity before Gravano ever took the stand. By the time the jury heard from the cooperating witness, they would have already heard the defendant himself describing the operations, the hierarchy, and the decision-making authority that the prosecution was asking them to find proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Gravano's testimony would not introduce new allegations. It would confirm, contextualize, and humanize evidence that already existed on magnetic tape. The tapes made the case. Gravano made the tapes impossible to misunderstand. Judge Glasser took an additional precaution that reflected the lessons of Gotti's previous trials. The jury was sequestered and held anonymous, their identities concealed from both the defense and the public, their movements controlled by federal marshals for the duration of the proceedings. The measure was extraordinary but justified by the documented history of jury tampering in Gotti's 1986 to 1987 racketeering trial, where a Gambino associate had successfully bribed a juror to hold out for acquittal. Glasser was determined that this trial would be decided on evidence alone, insulated from the external pressures that had corrupted previous proceedings. Gravano took the witness stand in March 1992, and for 9 days he dismantled the Gambino crime family from the inside. His testimony was delivered in a flat, controlled voice stripped of drama or self-pity. He described the organizational structure of the family with the precision of a corporate executive explaining an organizational chart. The chain of command from boss to underboss to consigliere to capos to soldiers to associates, the systems of tribute and revenue distribution, the protocols for authorizing murders, the rules governing relationships between families, the function of the commission as a governing body. He detailed his own induction ceremony, the oath of loyalty he had taken, the specific language and ritual that accompanied formal membership in La Cosa Nostra. He described murder after murder in which he had personally participated, naming victims, locations, methods, and the identities of co-conspirators with a specificity that left no ambiguity about the depth of his involvement or the reliability of his memory. Then he turned to John Gotti. Gravano described the planning of the Castellano assassination in operational detail, the meetings, the selection of the hit team, the coordination of surveillance on Castellano's movements, the positioning of the shooters outside Sparks, and the presence of Gotti and himself in the backup car across the street. He described Gotti's assumption of power in the weeks following the hit, the restructuring of the family's leadership, and the consolidation of authority that transformed Gotti from a Queen's capo into the boss of the most powerful crime family in America. He described the murders that followed, the sanctioned killings of members suspected of disloyalty, the enforcement actions against rivals, the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened Gotti's control. Each account was delivered with the same affectless precision, the voice of a man recounting operational history rather than personal trauma. The cross-examination was ferocious. Gotti's defense team hammered at Gravano's credibility with sustained intensity, forcing him to acknowledge the full scope of his criminal history, the leniency he expected in exchange for his testimony, and the fundamental moral contradiction of a 19-time killer being rewarded by the government for betraying his associates. Gravano absorbed the attacks without visible emotion. He did not attempt to minimize his crimes or present himself as a reformed man seeking redemption. He acknowledged what he had done. He acknowledged why he was cooperating. And he returned, again and again, to the factual substance of his testimony, the specific criminal acts he had witnessed, participated in, and been ordered to carry out by the man sitting at the defense table. The tapes corroborated him at every critical juncture. When Gravano described Gotti's authority over the family's operations, the prosecution played recordings of Gotti exercising that authority in his own words. When Gravano described the decision-making process behind specific criminal acts, the tapes captured Gotti discussing those same acts in the apartment above the rave night. The synchronization between human testimony and electronic evidence created a prosecutorial architecture that the defense could not dismantle. Attacking Gravano's character did not erase Gotti's voice from the tapes, and challenging the tape's context did not eliminate the first-hand witness who could explain precisely what every coded phrase and oblique reference meant. The trial lasted 8 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 14 hours. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was found guilty on all 13 counts of the federal indictment, including murder, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, illegal gambling, tax evasion, and loan sharking. Frank Locascio was convicted alongside him on all charges he faced. Judge Glasser sentenced Gotti to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Locascio received the same sentence. Gotti was transferred to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, a maximum security facility that at the time housed the federal prison system's most dangerous and high-profile inmates. Where he was placed in virtual isolation, his contact with the outside world reduced to monitored communications that ensured he could never again direct the operations of the family he had built through murder. The Teflon had finally cracked, and the man who cracked it was the man who had stood beside him from the beginning. Gravano received his reduced sentence in September 1994, 5 years for his admitted participation in 19 murders, a ratio of punishment to crime that remains one of the most controversial sentencing outcomes in the history of federal criminal prosecution. He entered the witness security program with a new identity and disappeared into the geography of American anonymity. His subsequent life would prove that cooperation with the government did not equate to personal transformation. In 2000, Gravano was arrested in Arizona for running an ecstasy distribution ring, a conviction that resulted in a 20-year state sentence and demolished the narrative of rehabilitation that the government's deal had implicitly promised. The man who had brought down John Gotti could not bring down his own nature. Gotti himself never accepted the verdict. From his cell at Marion, and later at the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado, he maintained his innocence, denounced Gravano as a liar and a coward, and insisted that the trial had been a government conspiracy designed to destroy a man whose only real crime was being Italian and successful. He never wavered from this position. He never cooperated. He never showed remorse. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died of throat cancer at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. He had spent the last decade of his life in a cell, the most famous prisoner in the federal system, a man whose name had become synonymous with both the glamour and the destruction of the American Mafia. The conviction of John Gotti did not end the Gambino crime family. It did not end organized crime in New York or in America. The 5 families continued to operate, diminished but not eradicated, adapting to a post-Gotti landscape in which the flamboyant public boss had been replaced by leaders who understood that visibility was a death sentence. But the trial of 1992 accomplished something that no previous prosecution had achieved. It demonstrated, with finality, that the code of omerta was not unbreakable, that even the highest-ranking member of the most powerful crime family in the country would betray his boss when the mathematics of loyalty no longer added up. The myth that had sustained La Cosa Nostra for generations, the belief that its members would die before they talked, died in a Brooklyn courtroom when a man named Salvatore Gravano raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and then did exactly that. The Mafia did not fall because the government grew stronger. It fell because the men inside had discovered that the loyalty they demanded from everyone else was a currency none of them were willing to spend on each other. Gotti betrayed Gravano on tape. Gravano betrayed Gotti on the witness stand. And the organization that had been built on the principle that its members would never turn against one another was ultimately destroyed by the oldest force in human nature, the refusal to be sacrificed for someone else's survival.